There are moments when life feels like walking through a house where all the lights have gone out. You know the furniture is still there. You remember where everything used to be, but your hands reach into darkness, grasping at what once felt solid and real. This isn't depression talking. This isn't anxiety whispering its familiar lies. This is something deeper, a kind of spiritual amnesia where the soul forgets its own name. When meaning evaporates, we don't just lose direction, we lose the very ground beneath our feet, the invisible thread that once connected us to something larger than our daily survival. And in that space between who we were and who we're becoming, we find ourselves asking the question that terrifies and liberates in equal measure. What if nothing I've built actually matters? She sits in her car after work, engine off, staring at the dashboard. Not because she's tired, but because going inside means pretending that today had purpose. The emails answered, the meetings attended, the conversations that filled space without touching depth. All of it feels like elaborate theater performed for an audience that isn't even watching. Her mind searches frantically for meaning the way a drowning person reaches for anything that floats. But the body knows something the mind hasn't learned yet. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is stop pretending we know why we're here. In that pause, between the noise of obligation and the nothingness of despair, something else becomes possible. Not answers, but a different kind of listening. The kind that doesn't need to understand in order to receive. We've been taught to hunt for purpose, like it's a lost object we can find if we just look hard enough. Take this course, read that book, follow these steps, and meaning will reveal itself like a prize at the end of a spiritual scavenger hunt. But what if purpose isn't something we find? What if it's something that finds us when we finally stop running from the parts of ourselves we've been too afraid to face? Jung spoke of the individuation process, the soul's journey toward wholeness that often begins with a kind of sacred disintegration. The old self must die before the authentic self can be born. And in that death, in that fertile emptiness, something unprecedented becomes possible. Purpose, real purpose, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers through the cracks in our carefully constructed lives. It speaks in the language of longing, of what makes us weep without knowing why, of the dreams that visit us when we finally stop demanding they make sense. There's a moment in every spiritual crisis when we realize that what we call meaninglessness might actually be meaning trying to break through the shell of who we thought we had to be. The feeling of emptiness, that hollow ache that no achievement seems to fill, isn't a sign that life has no purpose. It's a sign that the purpose we've been pursuing isn't ours. It belongs to the false self, the adapted self, the self that learned to perform meaning instead of living it. Real calling doesn't come through the mind's logical processes. It rises from the depths like ancient memory, like recognition, like coming home to a house you didn't know you'd been searching for your entire life. What is the feeling of emptiness trying to protect? Perhaps it's protecting the space where your true self waits, patient, infinite, knowing that meaning isn't something you achieve, but something you remember. He learned early that wanting too much was dangerous. At 7, when he said he wanted to be an artist, the room went quiet in that particular way that taught him his dreams were inconvenient. So he folded that part of himself into a place so small and dark that he almost forgot it existed. 30 years later, he has everything he was supposed to want. The career, the house, the life that looks perfect from the outside. But every morning feels like wearing clothes that don't fit, speaking words that aren't his, living a life that belongs to someone else's idea of success. The invisible child inside, the one who still believes in magic, who sees beauty in broken things, who knows that life is supposed to feel alive, has been locked away so long that when purpose comes knocking, he doesn't recognize its voice. He mistakes it for danger, for the kind of wanting that once brought disappointment and shame. Purpose as reunion with the forgotten self isn't just poetic language, It's the recognition that what we call meaninglessness is often the adult self trying to live without the parts of us that carry the soul's original instructions. The nervous system doesn't forget. It holds every moment when we were told our truth was too much, our dreams too big, our sensitivity too inconvenient for a world that demanded we be smaller, safer, more predictable. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research on trauma shows us that the body keeps the score, not just of dramatic events, but of all the small deaths of the authentic self. Each time we learn to silence our inner knowing, each time we chose safety over truth, the nervous system recorded it as a threat to avoid. So when purpose appears, when life offers us the chance to step into who we really are, the body remembers. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow. Ancient alarm bells ring, warning us away from the very thing our soul most longs for. She stands at the edge of a decision that could change everything. The opportunity to leave her corporate job and start the healing practice she's dreamed of for years. Her mind knows it's right, her soul vibrates with recognition, but her body feels like it's about to jump off a cliff. This isn't fear of failure. This is the nervous system protecting her from the kind of aliveness that once felt dangerous to express. The body, in its infinite wisdom and ancient conditioning, cannot distinguish between authentic expression and the threat of abandonment it once represented. In families where love was conditional on compliance, where approval came through performance rather than presence, the unconscious mind learns a devastating equation. To be truly yourself is to risk losing everything that matters. The child who was praised for being good and ignored when they were messy, creative, or authentically emotional grows into an adult whose very cells resist the call to purpose. Because purpose requires us to be real, and being real once meant being rejected. This is why so many people sabotage themselves just as they're about to break through. Why we find reasons not to start the project, not to have the conversation, not to take the step that would align us with our deepest calling. The unconscious is protecting us from what it perceives as annihilation. Jung called this the negative mother complex, not necessarily because our mothers were bad, but because somewhere in our development we internalized the message that our authentic nature was a threat to connection. And since connection meant survival, authenticity had to be sacrificed. Healing this split requires us to understand that the very sensitivity that made us vulnerable as children, our capacity to feel deeply, to see what others miss, to know things without knowing how we know them, is often the doorway to our truest purpose. The parts of ourselves we learn to hide may be the parts the world most needs us to express. Every spiritual tradition speaks of the wanderer, the one who must leave the familiar territory of who they've been in order to discover who they're becoming. Moses in the wilderness, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Jesus in the desert, the indigenous vision quest that strips away everything non-essential until only truth remains. But we've forgotten that wandering isn't failure. It's not a sign that we're lost or broken or behind where we should be. It's an ancient initiatory process where the soul deliberately chooses disorientation in order to find its true north. When life strips away our previous sources of meaning, when the job that once felt important now feels empty, when relationships that once sustained us now feel hollow, when the goals we've been pursuing suddenly seem pointless, we're not experiencing a breakdown. We're experiencing the beginning of a sacred breaking open. The desert doesn't give us what we want. It gives us what we need, the space to remember who we are when all the external definitions fall away. She wakes up one morning and realizes she can't remember why any of it matters. The promotion she's been working toward, the social circle she's carefully cultivated, the image she's been maintaining, all of it feels like costume jewelry, pretty, but ultimately meaningless. Her friends call it a midlife crisis. Her family suggests therapy for depression, but something deeper is happening. The soul is calling her into the desert of unknowing, where the false self finally runs out of strategies and the true self can emerge from its long hibernation. In the Sufi tradition, there's a practice called suluk, the journey of purification, where the seeker deliberately enters states of spiritual disorientation in order to transcend the ego's limited perspective. The wandering isn't random, it's ritualistic, purposeful, designed to burn away everything that isn't essential. This is what's happening when we feel lost in our lives. The soul is initiating us into a deeper level of being, but the mind interprets this sacred disorientation as failure because it doesn't understand the language of spiritual transformation. Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero's journey, how every meaningful life requires a departure from the known world, an encounter with forces beyond our control, and a return with gifts that can only be obtained through the willingness to be lost. But we live in a culture that pathologizes wandering, that treats uncertainty as a problem to be solved, rather than a doorway to be entered. We've forgotten that some kinds of knowledge can only be gained by not knowing, that some forms of finding require us to first be thoroughly lost. The purpose that emerges from this kind of sacred wandering isn't the purpose we set out to find. It's deeper, wilder, more authentic than anything the planning mind could have conceived. It's the purpose that chooses us when we finally stop trying to choose it. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." This isn't passive waiting. This is active engagement with uncertainty as a creative force. In quantum physics, there's a principle called the uncertainty principle, the idea that some aspects of reality cannot be precisely determined simultaneously. The very act of observing changes what we're observing. Perhaps the same is true for purpose. The harder we try to pin it down, the more it eludes us. But when we learn to live the questions, when we allow ourselves to not know while remaining fully present to what is, something else becomes possible. Purpose stops being something we pursue and becomes something that emerges naturally from our willingness to be real, to be present, to be available to what wants to happen through us. The Zen tradition speaks of don't know mind, a state of radical openness where we hold our knowing lightly enough that new understanding can enter. This isn't ignorance, it's a sophisticated form of wisdom that recognizes the limits of what the thinking mind can grasp. When we're in don't know mind, we stop trying to figure out our purpose and start paying attention to what draws us, what moves us, what feels alive in our bodies when we encounter it. Purpose stops being a destination and becomes a way of moving through the world, awake, responsive, aligned with something larger than our personal agendas. If this is resonating with you, if you're recognizing yourself in these words, I want you to know you're not alone in this journey. Hit that subscribe button so we can continue exploring these depths together, and let me know in the comments. What does wandering look like in your life right now? She had built the perfect life according to every metric that mattered. The corner office with the view, the relationship that looked beautiful on social media, the carefully curated existence that impressed everyone who knew her. She was successful, accomplished, everything her younger self had dreamed of becoming. But every morning felt like putting on armor that grew heavier with each passing day. The tasks that once energized her now felt like moving through thick mud. Conversations that used to spark something alive in her now sounded like dialogue from a movie she'd seen too many times. This wasn't ordinary burnout, the kind that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. This was existential burnout, the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from living a life that belongs to someone else's blueprint for success. Dr. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, identified what he called an existential vacuum, a pervasive sense of meaninglessness that comes not from external circumstances, but from the absence of authentic purpose. He observed that people could survive almost any suffering if they could find meaning in it, but they could be destroyed by comfort that felt empty. The breaking point isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet realization that you can't pretend anymore. You can't perform enthusiasm for a life that doesn't fit the shape of your soul. You can't keep investing energy in projects that feel like elaborate ways of avoiding who you really are. Jung wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social expectations, the carefully constructed identity that helps us function in the world, but can become a prison if we mistake it for who we actually are. For years, he had been the reliable one, the problem solver, the person everyone turned to when they needed something done. His entire sense of worth was built on being useful, being needed, being the person who never let anyone down. But somewhere in his 40s, the mask began to crack, not because of any external crisis, but because the energy required to maintain it was finally greater than the energy he had to give. The false self, no matter how functional, is ultimately unsustainable because it requires us to constantly deny parts of ourselves that need expression. The collapse, when it comes, feels like death. Because in a very real sense, it is death. The death of who we thought we had to be in order to be loved, accepted, successful in the world's terms. But Jung recognized this collapse as the beginning of individuation, the process by which we become who we actually are rather than who we've been conditioned to be. The breaking point isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough waiting to happen. In shamanic traditions, this kind of spiritual crisis is called shamanic illness, a period of disintegration that precedes a deeper integration, a death that makes space for a more authentic birth. The wounded healer emerges not despite their breaking, but because of it. There's a moment in every authentic spiritual journey when we finally stop trying to fix ourselves, improve ourselves, or become someone other than who we are. It feels like failure, like giving up, like spiritual bankruptcy. She had tried everything: meditation, therapy, life coaching, retreats, books, workshops, every modality and method that promised to help her find her purpose. She had vision boards and 5-year plans and daily affirmations. She had done the work, followed the steps, implemented the strategies, and none of it had worked. Not in the way she thought it should. She still woke up feeling like she was living someone else's life, still went through the motions of existence that felt hollow at its core. So she stopped. Not in despair exactly, but in a kind of exhausted surrender. She stopped trying to figure it out, stopped searching for the missing piece that would make everything make sense. She stopped performing spiritual seeking and simply allowed herself to be exactly as lost as she actually was. This moment of stopping, what the mystics call holy despair, is often the turning point, because it's only when we stop trying to manufacture meaning that authentic meaning can find us. It's only when we give up our agenda for enlightenment that something real can happen. The Persian poet Hafez wrote, "I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in darkness the astonishing light of your own being." Sometimes we have to extinguish all the artificial lights, all our ideas about who we should be and what our life should look like, before we can see the light that's been there all along. In the Celtic tradition, there's a concept called the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness that isn't punishment, but preparation. The mystic saint John of the Cross wrote about this as a necessary stage in spiritual development, where all previous sources of meaning and consolation are withdrawn so that the soul can learn to rest in something deeper. This isn't depression, though it can look like it from the outside. This is the soul's way of composting everything that isn't essential, breaking down the structures of the false self so that new life can grow from that rich darkness. He had always been driven, always reaching for the next goal, the next achievement, the next level of success that would finally make him feel complete. But the exhaustion that overtook him in his late 30s wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A deep unwillingness to continue performing for an audience that wasn't even paying attention. The exhaustion forced him to stop, to sit with the emptiness he had been running from his entire adult life. And in that stillness, something began to shift. Not answers exactly, but a different quality of listening. Not purpose handed down from above, but purpose emerging from below, from the depths he had been too busy to explore. Sacred exhaustion clears the ground the way forest fires clear underbrush, destroying what's no longer needed so that what wants to grow can finally take root. The breaking point isn't the end of the story. It's the compost from which the true story can begin. We expect meaning to announce itself clearly, to arrive with instructions and certainty. But the soul speaks a different language, older, subtler, more symbolic than the mind's preference for logical progression. She kept having the same dream, a house with rooms she'd never seen before, doors that opened onto impossible landscapes, a sense that she was both visitor and resident in this strange architecture of sleep. She mentioned it to friends who suggested dream dictionaries and psychological interpretations, but nothing quite captured the feeling the dream left behind, a sense of recognition mixed with longing. What if dreams aren't random neurological firing, but the soul's attempt to show us what we can't yet see with our waking eyes? Jung spent decades exploring the compensatory function of dreams, how the unconscious presents us with images and scenarios that balance what's missing in our conscious lives. The recurring house dream continued for months until she finally understood. The unexplored rooms weren't just psychological metaphors, they were invitations. The soul was showing her the parts of herself she hadn't yet inhabited, the potential that was waiting for her to stop looking outside and start exploring the vast interior landscape of who she could become. Symptoms, too, can be the soul's way of getting our attention, the insomnia that forces us to spend time with ourselves in the quiet hours, the anxiety that arises when we're about to make choices that aren't aligned with our truth, the depression that settles over us when we've been ignoring our deepest needs for too long. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes writes about soul loss, how we give away pieces of ourselves to survive in environments that don't welcome our wholeness. The symptoms we pathologize might be the soul's way of saying, something essential is missing, something vital needs attention, something true is trying to emerge. We've been conditioned to think of purpose as something that serves others, contributes to society, makes a measurable difference in the world. And while service can be a beautiful expression of purpose, it's not the only way meaning manifests. What if your purpose is simply to learn how to love yourself without condition? What if it's to heal patterns of trauma that have been passed down through generations? What if it's to bring a quality of presence to ordinary moments that transforms them into something sacred? He had always felt guilty about his introversion, his need for solitude, his preference for depth over breadth in relationships. In a culture that celebrates networking and social impact, his natural way of being felt selfish, unproductive, less valuable than the extroverted achievers around him. But slowly, he began to recognize that his gift wasn't in changing the world through external action, but in creating spaces where others could find the permission to be themselves. His purpose wasn't to be more social. It was to model a different way of moving through the world, more slowly, more intentionally, more attuned to the subtle currents that others often missed. Purpose doesn't have to be impressive. It doesn't have to fit on a resume or make sense to people who don't know you. It doesn't have to solve global problems or generate income or win approval from authorities you've never met. Sometimes purpose is as simple as learning to receive love without trying to earn it. Sometimes it's healing the parts of yourself that have been split off and denied. Sometimes it's discovering that your sensitivity, the thing you've always seen as weakness, is actually a form of genius that the world desperately needs. The mind thinks in words, but the soul speaks in sensations. Purpose isn't something we figure out, it's something we feel our way into, following the subtle guidance of what opens us and what closes us, what energizes us and what depletes us. She learned to pay attention to the quality of her breathing when different opportunities arose. The job interview that looked perfect on paper but made her chest tight with anxiety. The creative project that seemed impractical but made her feel like she was breathing clean air for the first time in months. The polyvagal theory developed by Dr. Stephen Porges shows us that the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in our body, is constantly assessing our environment for safety or threat, sending signals that influence everything from our heart rate to our ability to think clearly. When we're aligned with our authentic path, the nervous system relaxes, breathing deepens, the heart rate variability that indicates resilience increases. The body literally opens to receive more life force. But when we're forcing ourselves into situations that aren't aligned with our truth, no matter how good they look on paper, the body contracts. We hold our breath without realizing it. Our shoulders carry tension we can't explain. We develop mysterious aches and pains that medical tests can't identify. Learning to listen to purpose through the body means developing what somatic therapists call interoception, the ability to sense our internal landscape with accuracy and respect. It means trusting that the wisdom of the body often knows what the mind is still trying to figure out. Your body knows when you're in the presence of what's meant for you. It knows when you're pretending to be someone you're not. It knows when you're saying yes to things that are wrong for you and no to things that could transform your life. The path to purpose isn't always through the mind's analytical processes. Sometimes it's through the simple practice of following what feels alive, what opens your chest, what makes you breathe a little deeper, what helps you remember that being human can be a form of prayer. You wake up already behind. The mind immediately floods with tasks, obligations, the endless list of things that need to be done before you can finally rest. But rest never comes, because as soon as one urgency is handled, 3 more appear to take its place. This isn't just busyness. This is cortisol-driven existence, a state where the nervous system is so focused on immediate survival that it cannot perceive the subtle signals that point toward meaning. When we're trapped in chronic stress response, the part of the brain that can sense purpose, that can detect the golden thread of what wants to emerge through us, goes offline. Dr. Amy Arnstein's research on the prefrontal cortex shows us that stress literally hijacks our higher cognitive functions. The wise, contemplative, meaning-making part of ourselves becomes inaccessible when we're operating from a place of constant urgency. She realized she hadn't had a single quiet moment in months. Even her meditation practice had become another item on her to-do list, another thing to accomplish efficiently before moving on to the next requirement. The very practices meant to connect her with purpose had been colonized by the productivity mindset that was keeping her from herself. The ancient mystics knew something we've forgotten. Meaning emerges from stillness, not from action. It arises when we create enough space between thoughts, between obligations, between the constant demands of external life, that something deeper can speak. This is why purpose often appears during transitions, between jobs, between relationships, during illness or loss, moments when the usual structures of life are temporarily suspended and a different kind of knowing can emerge. We've been taught to think of dopamine as the pleasure chemical, but neuroscientist Dr. Anna Lemke reveals that dopamine is actually the molecule of seeking, of anticipation, of movement toward what we desire. It's not the reward itself, but the motivation that drives us toward what our system perceives as meaningful. But here's what's crucial. We can train our dopamine system to respond to inner alignment rather than external validation. We can create what I call ritualistic dopamine, small consistent practices that reward us for paying attention to our authentic self rather than our adapted self. He started keeping a journal by his bedside, not for productivity or goal setting, but for one simple practice. Each morning, before checking his phone or engaging with the demands of the day, he would write 3 sentences about what felt most alive in his dreams, in his body, in his heart, upon waking. This wasn't about finding immediate answers or making dramatic life changes. It was about training his nervous system to recognize and reward the moments when he was in contact with something real, something that belonged to him rather than to the expectations of others. Over time, his system began to crave these moments of inner listening more than the external hints of approval, achievement, or distraction. The dopamine pathways that had been hijacked by social media and urgent emails slowly rewired themselves to seek the deeper satisfaction of authentic contact with his own soul. Ritual creates a sacred container where meaning can be metabolized slowly, deliberately, without the pressure to immediately translate insight into action. It teaches the nervous system that there's value in simply being present to what is, rather than constantly reaching for what's next. In indigenous traditions around the world, there are three elements considered essential for spiritual health: silence that allows the soul to speak, rhythm that connects us to the larger pulse of life, and embodiment that grounds wisdom in lived experience rather than mental concepts. Modern life systematically disrupts all three. We live in constant noise, not just auditory, but the noise of information, obligation, the endless chatter of a mind that's never allowed to rest. We've lost connection to natural rhythms, forcing our bodies to operate according to artificial schedules that ignore our biological needs, and we live primarily in our heads, treating the body as a vehicle for the brain rather than recognizing it as a source of wisdom. She discovered that her most profound insights about purpose came not during intense meditation retreats or therapy sessions, but during her evening walks when she deliberately left her phone at home. Something about the simple rhythm of walking, the silence broken only by wind and footsteps, the felt sense of her body moving through space, created the conditions where deeper knowing could emerge. This isn't mystical thinking. This is practical neuroscience. Walking activates the default mode network in the brain, the same network that's active during creative insights and moments of inspiration. Rhythmic movement helps regulate the nervous system, moving us out of fight or flight and into the rest and digest state where healing and integration can occur. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma recovery emphasizes that healing happens not just through talking but through movement, rhythm, and the restoration of what he calls embodied self-awareness, the ability to sense what's happening inside our bodies and trust that information as valid and important. Purpose isn't always a lightning bolt of clarity. More often, it's a whisper that requires us to develop increasingly sensitive listening skills. What I call micro-listening, the practice of paying attention to the smallest shifts in energy, mood, physical sensation, and emotional resonance throughout the day. When you think about different possibilities for your life, what happens in your chest? When you imagine saying yes to one opportunity versus another, how does your breathing change? When you're in conversation with certain people, do you feel more yourself or less yourself? These micro-signals are how purpose communicates with us, not through grand revelations, but through the subtle feedback system of an embodied, awake nervous system. Learning to read these signals is like developing a new sense organ, one that can detect meaning the way the nose detects scent or the ears detect sound. The key is consistency rather than intensity. 5 minutes of daily micro-listening is more valuable than hours of sporadic soul-searching. The nervous system learns through repetition, through the patient building of new neural pathways that value inner signals as much as external demands. Your body is constantly sending you information about what's aligned and what's not, what opens you and what closes you, what feeds your soul and what depletes it. The question isn't whether this guidance is available. The question is whether you've developed the skills to receive it. You don't need to quit your job or move to another country to begin living with purpose. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen through gestures so small they're almost invisible, micro-offerings to the part of yourself that's been waiting patiently for recognition. She started lighting a single candle before her morning coffee, not as religious practice, but as a way of marking the transition between sleep and the demands of the day. That one flame became a portal, a moment of remembering that she existed not just as a function of productivity, but as a being capable of creating beauty, of honoring the mystery of being alive. The altar doesn't have to be elaborate or even visible to others. It can be as simple as taking 3 conscious breaths before opening your laptop, or placing your hand on your heart when you feel disconnected from yourself, or writing 1 sentence of gratitude for something that surprised you that day. These micro-rituals work because they interrupt the automatic patterns that keep us trapped in unconscious living. They create tiny gaps in the fabric of routine where something else, something more authentic, can slip through. Dr. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion shows that small, consistent acts of self-kindness literally rewire the brain's neural networks, creating new pathways that support resilience and authentic self-connection. Purpose isn't always about doing more. Sometimes it's about being more present, more gentle, more available to the subtle currents of our own experience. The blank page doesn't lie. It can't be impressed or manipulated or convinced to approve of you. When you sit with pen and paper, or fingers on keyboard, and allow whatever wants to emerge without editing, without performing, without trying to sound wise or coherent, you create a direct line of communication with parts of yourself that rarely get to speak. He had never considered himself a writer, but during a period of intense confusion about his life direction, he started setting his alarm 15 minutes earlier each morning just to write stream of consciousness pages. No agenda, no goal beyond filling 3 pages with whatever thoughts, complaints, dreams, or random observations wanted to come through. What emerged surprised him. Buried under years of practical considerations and other people's expectations, he discovered a voice that was curious about things he'd forgotten he cared about. Stories began appearing in his writing, not fiction exactly, but memories that revealed patterns, connections he hadn't seen before, dreams that pointed toward possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. Julia Cameron, in her book The Artist's Way, calls this practice morning pages, a way of clearing the mental clutter so that authentic creative impulses can surface. But you don't have to be an artist for this practice to work. You just have to be willing to meet yourself on the page without judgment, to let the mess be messy, to allow your inner world to reveal itself without immediately trying to fix or improve what you find there. Writing becomes a form of archaeological work, carefully uncovering layers of conditioning to discover what's been buried underneath. Not just what you think you should want, but what you actually want. Not just who you've been trained to be, but who you are when no one is watching. The breath is the only autonomic function that can be both conscious and unconscious, voluntary and involuntary. It's the bridge between the thinking mind and the wisdom of the body, between the personal self and something larger that breathes through us. Most of us spend our days in various states of held breath, literally holding our breath when we're concentrating, when we're anxious, when we're trying to get through something we don't want to be doing. This chronic breath-holding signals to the nervous system that we're in danger, that life is something to survive rather than something to experience. But conscious breathing, even just 3 full breaths taken with attention, can shift our entire physiological state. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, moving us out of fight or flight and into the state where healing, creativity, and authentic connection become possible. She learned to use her breath as an internal compass. Before making decisions, before entering difficult conversations, before responding to challenging situations, she would take a moment to breathe and ask her body, "What does my system need right now? What would honor both my truth and the situation I'm in?" The breath became her way of checking in with herself, of remembering that she had choice even in circumstances that felt overwhelming. It wasn't about breathing correctly or following a particular technique. It was about using the breath as a way of coming home to herself, again and again. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh meant when he wrote, "Breathing in, I know that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I am breathing out." It sounds simple to the point of being simplistic, but this kind of present moment awareness is radical in a culture that constantly pulls us away from ourselves. Purpose begins with presence. And presence begins with remembering that you're here, that you're alive, that this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this awareness that's reading these words is the ground from which all authentic action emerges. These practices might seem small, but they're the seeds from which profound transformation grows. What resonates most with you? What's one micro-ritual you could begin today? Share in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this video has been helpful on your journey, subscribe to continue this exploration together. There's so much more to discover about the mystery of living an authentic life. There's an ancient story told in many cultures about a person who spends their entire life searching for a treasure that was buried in their own backyard. They travel to distant lands, consult wise teachers, endure great hardships, only to return home exhausted and empty-handed, only to discover that what they were seeking was always right where they started. Purpose isn't something we acquire from the outside world. It's not a destination we reach through sufficient effort or a prize we earn through spiritual accomplishment. It's more like a seed that was planted in us before we were born, waiting for the right conditions to sprout and grow. The conditions aren't perfect circumstances or the absence of confusion. The conditions are readiness, the willingness to stop looking everywhere else and start paying attention to what's already here. The courage to tend the small, seemingly insignificant stirrings that arise when we finally get quiet enough to listen. She had been searching for her purpose for so long that she'd forgotten it was searching for her too. All those years of workshops and self-help books and vision boards, they weren't wasted, but they weren't the answer either. They were the preparation, the tilling of soil that had been too hard and distracted to receive what wanted to grow. When she finally stopped searching and started simply being present to what was alive in her in each moment, purpose began revealing itself, not as a single grand mission, but as a quality of attention she could bring to whatever she was doing. Purpose as a way of being rather than a thing to achieve. The mystic Rumi wrote, "What you seek is seeking you. Not eventually, not when you become worthy enough or clear enough or healed enough. Right now. Purpose is already here, already present, already attempting to express itself through the unique constellation of gifts and wounds and experiences that make you who you are." We live in a culture obsessed with meaning-making, with turning every experience into a lesson, every challenge into a growth opportunity, every moment of suffering into material for personal development. But sometimes the most healing thing we can do is stop trying to make sense of our lives and simply allow ourselves to feel them. He had spent years analyzing his childhood trauma, understanding the psychological patterns that shaped his relationships, mapping the neural pathways that kept him stuck in old behaviors. All of that work had value, but it hadn't actually healed him. Healing came when he finally allowed himself to feel the sadness he'd been thinking his way around for decades. Not the sadness about anything in particular, just the pure sadness of being human in a world that often feels too beautiful and too broken to bear. The sadness of loving people who die, of having dreams that don't come true, of being sensitive in systems that don't know how to hold sensitivity with care. When he stopped trying to fix this sadness and started simply feeling it, something unexpected happened. Underneath the sadness was something else, a tenderness, a capacity for love that was directly proportional to his capacity for grief. The very sensitivity that had felt like curse revealed itself as the source of his greatest gifts. Purpose doesn't always arrive as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as willingness. The willingness to feel what you feel without immediately trying to change it. The willingness to be exactly where you are without rushing toward where you think you should be. Life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do is stop trying to extract meaning from every moment and simply show up for the profound ordinariness of being alive. The Greek word for truth is aletheia, which literally means not forgetting or unconcealment. Truth isn't something we learn, it's something we remember. Purpose isn't something we find, it's something we uncover, like an archaeologist carefully brushing dirt away from something that was always there. Remembering yourself means removing the layers of conditioning that have accumulated over a lifetime of trying to be acceptable, successful, safe. It means peeling back the adaptations and compromises and performances until you reach the essential self that existed before you learned to be anyone else. This isn't a return to childhood innocence. This is a return to essential nature, but now informed by experience, tempered by wisdom, refined by all the ways you've been broken and healed, lost and found, scattered and gathered back together. She realized that every job she'd ever hated had taught her something about what she truly valued. Every relationship that had ended had shown her something about how she wanted to love and be loved. Every period of confusion and meaninglessness had been preparation for a deeper kind of clarity that could only emerge through the willingness to not know. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of basic goodness, the idea that underneath all our neuroses and patterns and struggles, there's something fundamentally awake and healthy and whole. Purpose isn't about becoming someone new, it's about remembering who you've always been beneath all the stories about who you're supposed to be. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not missing some essential piece that everyone else received at birth. You are exactly where you need to be for the next layer of your becoming to unfold. The emptiness you've been running from isn't evidence that your life lacks meaning. It's evidence that you've outgrown the meaning you were given and are ready to discover the meaning that's yours alone to live. The confusion isn't a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be entered. The wandering isn't wasted time, but sacred preparation. The breaking isn't failure, but the necessary cracking open that lets the light get in. Your purpose isn't hiding somewhere in the future, waiting for you to become good enough to claim it. It's here now, in this moment, in the simple fact that you're still breathing, still seeking, still willing to believe that your life can become an expression of something beautiful and true. The mystics have always known what the modern world has forgotten. You don't find your purpose. You surrender to it. You don't create meaning. You become transparent enough for meaning to move through you. Stop searching. Start remembering. The treasure has always been buried in your own backyard. The only question is whether you're finally ready to come home. If these words have touched something true in you, if you're ready to stop searching and start remembering, I want to hear from you. What's one thing you're ready to remember about yourself? Share it in the comments. Your truth might be the permission someone else needs to claim their own. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the depths of what it means to be authentically human, and click on the next video I've recommended for you. The exploration continues, but only if you're willing to take the next step into the mystery of who you really are.